At 68, Gregory Warren embraced every day as a chance to stay active, both in body and mind. As a retired U.S. Attorney General, he was no stranger to long hours and heavy responsibilities. But now, life in Bellawood, a picturesque town with its tree-lined streets and warm, welcoming neighbors, was a quiet retreat. Each morning, Gregory laced up his running shoes, donned his favorite blue windbreaker, and set out for a jog. It wasn't just about fitness. It was his way of staying connected to the world, observing the subtle rhythms of life in his town. That Thursday morning was no different. The air was crisp, filled with the faint aroma of fresh-baked bread from Bella's bakery. Gregory greeted familiar faces as he passed. Mr. Peterson, watering his garden, Mrs. Hall walking her tiny terrier, and the bakery owner, waving from behind the counter. He loved the predictability of these moments. They reminded him of the simpler values he'd fought to protect during his career. As he approached the narrow alley beside the bakery, something disrupted the serene morning. A muffled cry echoed through the quiet, faint yet distinct. Gregory's pace slowed, his well-honed instincts kicking in. He scanned the alley, his sharp eyes narrowing at the sight of an elderly woman struggling against two young men. One had his hand on her purse, yanking it with force. The other clutched her wrist, trying to remove a delicate bracelet. The woman's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Gregory didn't think twice. "Hey, leave her alone," he bellowed, his commanding voice cutting through the tension. The two men turned to him, startled. For a moment they hesitated, as if sizing up the older man. Gregory stepped closer, his fists clenched, his stance unwavering. Despite his age, there was a fire in his eyes that spoke of years spent standing against injustice. Cowards by nature, the men bolted without another word, disappearing into the shadows. Gregory watched them go, his heart pounding. He turned to the trembling woman, her hands clutching the frayed strap of her empty purse. "Are you all right, man?" he asked gently, his voice softening. "They took everything," she whispered through tears, her words barely audible. "Don't worry," Gregory assured her. "You're safe now." The peaceful morning had been shattered, but Gregory knew his work wasn't done. Gregory Warren's relief at scaring off the attackers was short-lived. The elderly woman, still trembling, leaned against the wall of the bakery, clutching the empty strap of her purse. Gregory crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "Ma'am, did they hurt you?" he asked, his voice calm but concerned. She shook her head weakly, though her hand trembled as she touched her wrist where the bracelet had been. Before Gregory could offer further reassurance, the piercing wail of a police siren broke the morning stillness. A sleek black and white cruiser pulled up at the alley entrance, its tires screeching as it came to a halt. Gregory waved toward the car, relieved that law enforcement had arrived so quickly. He expected assistance, someone to track the fleeing criminals. Instead, the officer who emerged from the vehicle, a young man with a buzz cut and a tense expression, locked eyes with Gregory and barked, "Step away from her." Gregory froze, his brow furrowing. "Officer, I was helping her," he explained, his voice steady but confused by the hostility. "I said step away." The officer, whose name tag read Cassidy, snapped again, his hand hovering dangerously close to his holster. The elderly woman, still shaking, tried to intervene. No, he's not." "Ma'am, I'll handle this," Cassidy interrupted, cutting her off as he advanced toward Gregory. Gregory raised his hand slowly, his instincts warning him to tread carefully. "Listen, there's been a misunderstanding. I stopped the attackers. They ran off before you arrived." Cassidy's eyes narrowed, his tone laced with suspicion. "Right? And I'm supposed to believe that?" Gregory took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. The alley now seemed smaller, the walls pressing in as the tension grew. "Officer," Gregory began, his voice deliberate, "I've spent decades in law enforcement. I know how this works. Let's not escalate things." But Cassidy wasn't listening. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, louder this time. The small crowd that had gathered just beyond the alley entrance began murmuring among themselves. Phones were raised, recording the scene as Gregory stood motionless, his hands still raised. The elderly woman pleaded again, stepping closer. "Officer, please, he's telling the truth. He saved me." Cassidy ignored her, his focus locked on Gregory. "What were you doing here, old man? Waiting for your chance to get away?" Gregory's jaw tightened, his patience thinning. "I told you, I was helping her." But Cassidy's mind was made up, his assumptions clouding his judgment. "Save it for the judge," he muttered, taking a step closer. The once peaceful street of Bellawood now buzzed with tension, a stark contrast to the harmony Gregory had come to cherish. His heart sank as he realized this was no longer about justice. It was about survival. The air in the alley felt heavy, charged with the weight of misunderstanding. Gregory's hands remained raised, his sharp mind racing to de-escalate the situation. Officer Cassidy's hand hovered perilously close to his holster, his gaze unwavering and filled with suspicion. The elderly woman stepped forward again, desperation in her voice. "Officer, you're wrong. He's the one who saved me." But Cassidy waved her off. "Ma'am, stay back. I've got this under control." Gregory's voice remained calm, though his frustration was beginning to seep through. "Officer, I don't want to escalate this any further. Let me explain." Cassidy's tone was sharp, cutting him off. "You don't get to explain. You're just lucky I haven't cuffed you already." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, their unease evident. Someone shouted, "Why won't you listen to him?" Others whispered, their phones aimed squarely at the unfolding scene. Gregory took a deep breath, his years of experience in law enforcement guiding him. He knew one wrong move could turn this volatile moment into a disaster. Slowly, he lowered one hand toward his pocket, keeping his movements deliberate and measured. "Don't move," Cassidy shouted, drawing his gun with a quick motion. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath. Gregory froze, his voice steady as he replied, "I'm reaching for my identification. Nothing else." Cassidy's eyes narrowed. "I said don't move." "Officer, listen to me," Gregory said firmly, his tone calm but commanding. "If you'd like to see proof of who I am, I need to show you my badge." The tension was palpable as Gregory continued his slow movement, reaching into his pocket. Cassidy's finger hovered near the trigger, his expression hard and unyielding. Finally, Gregory pulled out a sleek leather case and flipped it open, revealing a gold badge that caught the sunlight. He held it up for Cassidy and the growing crowd to see. "Take a good look," Gregory said, his voice sharp with authority. Cassidy hesitated, his eyes scanning the badge. The engraved words glinted in the light, United States Department of Justice. Beneath them was Gregory's name, unmistakably clear. The officer's face paled. His grip on the gun faltered as realization set in. "My name is Gregory Warren," Gregory said, his voice steady and resolute. "I'm the former United States Attorney General." The crowd murmured louder, the atmosphere shifting. Cassidy's hand trembled as he lowered his gun, his face a mix of shock and shame. I didn't know," Cassidy stammered, his voice unsteady. "You didn't know," Gregory replied, his tone sharp but controlled, "because you didn't ask. Instead, you made assumptions. Dangerous ones." The crowd buzzed with whispers. Someone in the back muttered, "He's in trouble now." The elderly woman, emboldened by Gregory's show of authority, stepped forward. "Officer, he's telling the truth. He stopped those thieves. He saved me." Cassidy's face turned red as he tried to stammer out an apology, but Gregory wasn't finished. "Pointing a gun at an innocent man isn't just a mistake, officer, it's a failure of judgment." The crowd murmured their agreement, the atmosphere heavy with a mix of tension and vindication. Gregory remained calm, his focus unwavering. He knew this wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about setting an example for everyone watching. The uneasy silence stretched as Officer Cassidy stood frozen, his gun now lowered but his humiliation evident. Gregory's calm, commanding presence loomed larger with each passing second. The crowd grew bolder, their voices murmuring in discontent. "You see what happens when you jump to conclusions?" someone muttered loudly. Another voice chimed in. "He could have been hurt because of this." Cassidy fumbled for words, his confidence crumbling under the weight of his mistake. "Sir, I didn't mean." "You didn't mean to point a gun at an innocent man?" Gregory interrupted, his voice firm but controlled. "That's not just carelessness, officer. That's reckless and dangerous." The elderly woman, still shaken but emboldened by Gregory's authority, stepped closer. Her voice, though trembling, was clear. "He saved me," she repeated, her eyes fixed on Cassidy. "Those boys ran off because of him. You were ready to arrest the wrong man." Cassidy opened his mouth to respond, but a new arrival cut him off. A second police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing as Sergeant Emily Harper stepped out, her expression grave. She took in the scene quickly. The distressed woman, the armed officer, and Gregory standing tall, his badge still visible. "What's going on here?" Harper demanded, her sharp gaze moving from Cassidy to Gregory and back. Gregory extended his hand, presenting his badge once more. "Sergeant, my name is Gregory Warren. I'm a former United States Attorney General. I intervened when this woman was being robbed. Your officer arrived after the criminals fled and immediately treated me as a suspect." Harper's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing at Cassidy. "Is this true, Officer Cassidy?" Cassidy hesitated, then nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "Yes, ma'am," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Harper sighed, her face darkening with disapproval. "Officer Cassidy, you're relieved of duty, effective immediately. Hand over your firearm and badge." Cassidy's eyes widened in shock. "Ma'am, please, it was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding that could have ended tragically," Harper cut him off. "This is not how we conduct ourselves." As Cassidy reluctantly handed over his equipment, the crowd murmured their approval. "Finally, some accountability," someone said. The elderly woman stepped closer to Harper, her voice steady now. "He saved me. If it weren't for him, who knows what those boys would have done." Harper turned back to Gregory, her tone respectful. "Mr. Warren, I'm deeply sorry for what happened here. Thank you for your courage and for showing restraint where it was lacking." Gregory gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty, Sergeant. It's about protecting the innocent. That includes how officers conduct themselves." Harper's face flushed slightly, but she nodded. "You're absolutely right." As Cassidy was escorted to a waiting vehicle, the crowd began to disperse, some still filming, others murmuring among themselves. Gregory turned back to the elderly woman, his tone softening. "Are you all right now, ma'am?" She nodded, a faint smile breaking through her tears. "Thanks to you, yes." But as Gregory looked around at the lingering onlookers, he knew this incident wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had watched, who had seen both failure and justice play out in real time. For Gregory, it was another reminder of why the fight for fairness and integrity was never over. The crowd thinned as the tension eased, leaving Gregory standing in the now quiet alley with the elderly woman and Sergeant Harper. The echoes of what had transpired still lingered in the air. The weight of the incident, however, had shifted, not from Gregory's shoulders, but onto the systems and behaviors that had allowed such a grave mistake to occur. Harper stepped closer to Gregory, her expression still apologetic. "Mr. Warren," she began, her voice measured, "I'll personally ensure a thorough investigation is conducted. Officer Cassidy's actions today were unacceptable. You have my word." Gregory studied her face, reading the sincerity in her eyes. "Sergeant, accountability doesn't end with one officer. This is about the culture of assumptions, about failing to ask questions before making judgments." Harper nodded, understanding the depth of his words. "You're right, and I'll take that to heart." The elderly woman, still clutching the strap of her empty purse, stepped forward. "Mr. Warren," she said softly, her voice laced with gratitude, "you saved me. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened. Gregory offered her a small, reassuring smile. I did what anyone should have done, ma'am. I only wish those young men could have been caught. Are you sure you're not hurt? She shook her head. No, just shaken. But you didn't have to risk yourself for me. You're a hero. Gregory frowned slightly, shaking his head. No, ma'am. I'm just a man who believes in doing what's right. That's not heroism. It's humanity. At that moment, another officer approached with a notebook in hand. Sir, ma'am, may I take your statements for the report? He asked. Gregory gestured toward the elderly woman. Start with her. She's the victim here. Her story is what matters most. As the woman began recounting the events, Gregory stepped aside, his sharp eyes scanning the street. His gaze fell on a few bystanders still lingering, some murmuring to each other, others watching intently. He knew that moments like these, public and raw, were rare opportunities for real change. One young man approached cautiously, his phone still in hand. Sir, he said, his voice slightly shaky, I saw everything. I've got it recorded. If you need it for evidence or anything, let me know. Gregory nodded, grateful. Thank you. That footage might help ensure accountability. As the young man stepped back into the dispersing crowd, Gregory turned back to Harper. What happens next, Sergeant? We'll follow protocol, Harper replied. Cassidy will face disciplinary action, and this report will be reviewed at the highest level. And Mr. Warren, I'll see to it that today's events are used as a case study for training, so no one else goes through this. Gregory considered her words before nodding. Make sure it's not just words on paper. Change comes when actions follow. Harper held his gaze, determination etched into her features. You have my promise. The scene began to wind down, police cruisers departing and the street returning to its quiet state. Gregory turned to the elderly woman, who now looked calmer. Do you have someone to call? Someone to take you home? She nodded. I do. Thank you again, Mr. Warren. You're more than a man. You're a beacon of what we should all strive to be. Gregory smiled faintly, touched by her words, but knowing they carried a responsibility he'd never set down. As he watched her walk away, he turned toward the empty alley, the morning sunlight breaking through the shadows. Justice had been served, but the larger battle for fairness was far from over. As Gregory stepped out of the alley and back onto the main street, the morning sun bathed Bellawood in a golden glow. The tension that had gripped the town only moments ago seemed to dissipate, leaving a sense of quiet reflection in its wake. Gregory resumed his jog, slower this time, his mind replaying the events of the morning. It wasn't the first time he had faced a misunderstanding rooted in haste and bias. But today felt different. The weight of the crowd's watchful eyes, the smartphones recording every second, and the murmurs of judgment had brought the stakes to a new level. It was a reminder of how far society still had to go, even in a seemingly idyllic place like Bellawood. As he passed familiar landmarks, the bakery, the bookstore, the small park where children laughed and played, he noticed the subtle changes in how people looked at him. A few nodded respectfully, others waved hesitantly. One man even stopped mid-step, lifting a hand as if to say something before thinking better of it. Gregory could feel the shift, the silent acknowledgement of his actions and his calm under pressure. Near the park bench where he often rested during his runs, a young woman holding a toddler approached him. Her face was earnest, her eyes wide with gratitude. Mr. Warren, she began, her voice soft but steady. I saw what happened back there. Thank you for standing up, for showing everyone what true courage looks like. Gregory smiled warmly but humbly. I only did what was right. That's something we all have a responsibility to do. The woman nodded. I know, but the way you handled it, it inspired people. You didn't let anger control you. That's rare. As she walked away, Gregory took a seat on the bench, letting the breeze cool his thoughts. He hadn't set out that morning expecting to become a symbol of integrity. Yet, as a former attorney general, he understood the weight of moments like these. They weren't about personal glory. They were opportunities to remind people of the power of fairness and humanity. A few minutes later, Sergeant Harper pulled up in her cruiser. She stepped out, her expression more relaxed but still serious. "Mr. Warren," she called, approaching him. "Sergeant," Gregory replied, standing to greet her. "I wanted to thank you again," she said. "Not just for what you did, but for how you handled it. The department could learn a lot from you." Gregory gave a slight nod. "Change takes more than words, Sergeant. It takes accountability. You have a responsibility to make sure today isn't forgotten." Harper's gaze was steady. "I'll see to it. You have my word." As she left, Gregory resumed his jog, his pace steady, his thoughts clear. The streets of Bellwood felt different now, charged with a renewed sense of awareness and respect. The events of the morning had sent ripples through the town, sparking conversations about bias, integrity, and what it truly meant to serve and protect. For Gregory, it wasn't just about the moment, it was about the message. As he rounded the last corner toward his home, he saw a neighbor standing by her mailbox. She smiled and waved, her voice carrying across the street. "Thank you, Mr. Warren, for everything." Gregory smiled back, tipping his cap. The world still had its flaws, but moments like these reminded him why he had dedicated his life to justice. Sometimes, all it took was one man standing firm in the face of injustice to inspire others to do the same. Justice, he thought, wasn't just his profession. It was his purpose. And in Bellwood, it had found a new voice. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.